Okay, so let's move on to the next part of our morning. So I am here to introduce Ofelia García. She is a renowned author, award-winning researcher, and Professor Emerita in the PhD programs of both urban education and Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her work on translanguaging has been revolutionary and incredible. I'd like to detour slightly into my own situation. In Malta, which is where I'm from, we flexibly and constantly use two languages, Maltese, which is a blend of Semitic and Latin-based words and grammar systems, and English. So unthinkingly, we weave together both languages, forming a kind of tapestry of meaning, calling on both languages simultaneously, starting in one language and finishing a sentence in the other. And to one extent or another, all of us Maltese people do it. And yet, despite its ubiquitousness in Malta, discussions and debates rage. Should academics allow this unconscious overlap of languages, as if they have any control over it? Should students be hemmed into choosing and sticking to one language over the other at any point in time? Will the prevalence of English destroy the Maltese language and take away our identity? And of course, here is where Ofelia comes in. Ofelia was born in Cuba to a Spanish-speaking family, and at the age of 11, moved to New York, which is a bilingual city where Spanish and English coexist in their bilingual tapestry. And this was the background for Ofelia's investigation and research into how bilingualism is perceived, not only linguistically, but also socially and politically. And this became her groundbreaking work on translanguaging. She says that translanguaging goes beyond code switching and translation and goes to the very heart of the processes by which bilinguals use multiple discursive practices in order to make sense of their bilingual world. So, I'd like to invite Ofelia to the stage to tell us more about this absolutely fascinating topic. Ofelia García, please, everyone.
Bueno, gracias, Jean, for that wonderful introduction. It's hard to follow David Crystal, and I'm honored to be here after him. And I want to start by thanking the organizers of this conference. This is not an association that I have belonged to, but I'm really honored to be here. And I'm humbled by all your international experience that you bring. I want to start by thanking Gabriel Diaz-Majoli for this invitation. He's a Uruguayan, a place that Ricardo and I love because we have taught there at the university. And I also want to acknowledge Sarah Ward for all her work in organizing and getting us here. I am here with my husband, Ricardo Otegui, who's my co-author, my partner in crime sometimes. And it's wonderful to be here and have learned so much from all of you and the sessions that we have attended, all the plenaries, Evan, Divya, Leslie, and I'm really grateful to Jason Anderson and to many of you who have started the conversation about translanguaging here at IATEFL. So thank you for all you have taught me in the last few days. So I want to talk to you very simply about two ideas, or one idea, the idea that English ideologies many times act as a barrier in the teaching and learning of English, and then the idea that translanguaging might be a way to remove those ideological barriers of English in the teaching and learning of English. What are English language ideologies, and why am I saying that they're barriers? Because on the one hand, on the left side, We think of English as being just a linguistic structure, an entity that is a static computational system, and that it is an entity that actually can be taught and had as a native. However, all of that ideology and conception of what English is silences and hides the reality behind English, the fact that it is really filled with power, dominance, hegemony over many, many of us, the role that it has had in colonization, and what the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano calls coloniality, that is the remnants of what happened after the colonizers left, its role in a neoliberal global economy, its role in construction of whiteness as superior to everything else, the ideology of native speakers, and the racial linguistic ideologies that see everyone who is different as being deficient speakers. So all of these are things that the ideology of English that we hold on to hide, and I think it's time to bring it forward. I want to also remind all of you that by teaching English, you are really developing bilinguals, multilinguals in many cases. But bilingualism and multilingualism has also been constructed ideologically as a barrier, precisely because it has been based on the conception of what monolinguals do with two languages. So we are taught, and I have been taught, I was a student of Joshua Fishman, whom I greatly admire and whom I always say I learned everything I know from Fishman 101, but he taught me to look beyond the concepts that he taught. And I think that is where we need to be. We need to free ourselves from these frameworks that have been given to us and look at really what people do with language, right? So this bilingual, multilingual ideology always thinks that bilingualism is additive. There's a first language, and then you add a second language. Now think of why it is that this concept has reigned in our understanding of bilingualism, because it has been framed with a monolingual stance. It has been framed for monolinguals, and therefore we think of bilingualism being developed sequentially, and everybody really having a first language to which a second language has been added. And as Tobes Kubnakangas told us many, many years ago, this doesn't make sense for many of us, right? Because there are different criteria by which we identify an L1. I can tell you that maybe chronologically, Spanish was my L1. I can also tell you that today, it depends on who's looking at me and what language they identify me with and what language I feel in my inside is my first language. So these are concepts that do not make sense for many of us who have grown up as simultaneous bilinguals, right? So the goal has always been seen as a double separate monolingualisms. And again, François Grosjean told us a long time ago that this could not be, that bilinguals are not two separate monolinguals, but that they have to be, but the ideology is that the two languages always have to be separated, that there is a diglossia, and in order to have a stable bilingual, multilingual society, you have to have a diglossic allocation of languages without thinking that what we're describing is, of course, a situation in many societies, but a situation that is given by power. The reason why some languages have what are called high functions and some languages have low functions is not in nature, it is in the construction of what we have done with language and the ways in which we have used language to dominate some people over others. We always think of bilinguals as when we describe their speech, their utterances, we always speak of them as having language contact. And again, these were very important scholars who brought bilingualism to the fore when no one was really even acknowledging bilingualism. But again, what we have to remember is that Weinreich and Haugen and all of those scholars were working at a specific time in which the idea was that anybody who had language contact had interferences, right? So we named all these interferences. We named loans, we named cogs, we named code switching. And by the way, these are things that I also did in my youth, because that's what we were taught to do, right? And the idea, of course, that bilingualism and multilingualism, this just happened in peaceful coexistence, right? When we know that what is happening with the conception of bilingualism and multilingualism as has been given to us is that there has been a silencing of the complex, dynamic, multilingual practices of the global south. And by the way, I adhered here to the concept given to us by the decolonial theorist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who talks, of course, about the idea that the global south is not just geographical, it's epistemological, so that we find the global south in England the same way we find it in the United States. The silencing of non-white multilingual speakers, learners in what I call El Sur, because, you know, I have lived in what José Martí, who's a Cuban poet, patriot, 19th century, late 19th century, called Las entrañas del monstruo, the bowels of the monster, which is New York City. And there you find people from El Sur, also in the geographical north, right? And the idea that there's a silencing of the simultaneous multilingualism that Jean was describing before, and the idea that this has not been constructed peacefully, that this involves language domination and conflict. Okay, doesn't want to go anywhere. Nope, it stopped working. Hello. The clicker has no battery. Let's just wait. Gives me a chance to have some water. Huh? Okay, so it works. So what I wanted all of us to understand is what is really missing in these ideologies of English and bilingualism is the people, right? So how do we take into account the people who are speakers of English or becoming English speakers, their histories, their interactions, and take into account what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the abyssal line, that line that has been drawn between the North and the South, that line that divides us, that line that does not let us see what is beyond what we already are comfortable with, our own epistemologies. It doesn't let us see what else exists. It calls practices on the other side of the line magical, folkloric, corrupted, instead of realizing that they are practices also that respond maybe to different epistemologies. So let me just go back and repeat what I've said before, that English language ideologies often work as a barrier in teaching because we think of it as an objective entity, because we separate it from speakers, and because it resides not in the speakers whom we taught, whom we see, but controlled by nation states and its institutions, especially, of course, schools. So let me just review with you the programs where we usually teach English, the goals, and the pedagogical traditions that have come along with the teaching of English, right? So we have English language arts, usually, at least in the United States, something that is taught all through school, and we think about ELA only for monolinguals. Sometimes our classrooms are filled with multilingual students, but we don't even consider that because it has been framed as being only for monolinguals. And of course, the pedagogical tradition has been just teaching language arts as if everybody was monolingual. Then there's a foreign language tradition, of course, of EFL. And again, the idea is that EFL has been for monolinguals, and the pedagogical tradition, of course, is that it's taught as a foreign language. Of course, these things are changing, and I'm grateful for the work of all the ELF people, Hilary Jenks and everybody else who's here in the audience, but still, the tradition is still very much that of just teaching a language to people who are going to be using that language in another society, not in theirs. And then there are programs where we really bring in the bilinguals, right? So English as second language programs always develop bilinguals in some way, but we don't consider that. We think that it is done only towards monolingualism. And the pedagogical practice that we use are, again, adaptations, mostly of foreign language pedagogical practices, with a little bit of language arts built in. And finally, there's bilingual education, where, again, English is also taught. But again, the idea always is that it has to be towards two monolingualisms, even if the students are already bilingual, or even if the objective of the program is to develop bilinguals. And then there are these adaptations of language arts and foreign language, including what we call bilingual education pedagogical practices and what you in Europe have called CLIL. So the idea, of course, is that that I've been trying to say is that really English is operating as a system of control, as a barrier, that is always separate from many people. They're languaging, they're doing language, and their epistemologies, their knowledge systems, right? And even in bilingual education and ESL programs, where students are really emergent bilinguals, it may look bilingual or multilingual on the outside, but I always say on the inside, it's really monoglossic, right? So let me just give you an example of how this takes place in classrooms. So this is a first grader in New York City who is Paco. He's a Latino bilingual child, And he writes this for his first grade teacher, the journal. And the journal says, "Me at Nochebuena for a sleepover at Abuela and Abuelo's house." Okay, pretty good, right? But of course, Paco's first grade English teacher, who's monolingual, has questions about this. She asks, well, there are some words that Paco doesn't know in English, and he has to use Spanish. He mixes English and Spanish. There are interferences between his two languages. He's really very deficient, and he's confused because he uses these two languages, and he needs remediation. And then she has questions because, again, all her framework about language and bilingualism have been framed with these ideologies that we just went through. So she asks, well, what is his first language? No answer to that, right? Is he an English language learner? All of a sudden, bilingualism is a problem. Is he an English language learner? Is he a native English speaker? She doesn't know. And what she's not considering is that Paco is really a very creative and purposeful user of his entire repertoire. And what he's doing is he's selecting from his repertoire features that really express what he's about. So it's not Christmas Eve, because he has a grandfather who's Italian, and Christmas Eve at his grandfather's house means having 7 fishes. When he goes to his abuela's house, abuela has Nochebuena, not Christmas Eve. So this child is not confused. He is selecting features from his repertoire that represent him. But the teacher has this English language ideology that the mere presence of these factors is indeed a sign of deficiency. And I'm not going to go through Mr. Antonio, because I think you know Mr. Antonio's classroom. He's a teacher in Peru. He's an English teacher in Peru. He's a secondary English teacher. We're going to go back to Mr. Antonio. That's why I'm bringing him up now. But basically, he wants to make sure that everybody speaks only English, reads only English, writes only English. The texts are really very simple. The students are inquisitive, but they can only speak English. They can only question in English. He does a whole bunch of whole classroom work and individual work, but never group work, because, of course, if there's group work, they're not going to be speaking English. There's an emphasis on what he calls a native pronunciation. And you know, here I came to Harrogate, and then I realized, oh, it's not Harrogate, it's Harrogate, right? So, I mean, English is very complex, and I don't know what the native pronunciation is, I can tell you. And this emphasis on correction and eradication of all that he calls interferences, and that's his whole activity is just policing this barrier. And so the question that I have for all of us is, why is English policing in English teaching? Why? Why does it exist? What message does it give to the speakers, to the listeners, to the students? And what are its consequences? And I think we have to think hard about what are its consequences. And what I'm bringing in today is an alternative to this policing of English. Is the idea that translanguaging could be an alternative to remove this barrier of English. And what is translanguaging? And I have ing in capital letters, because I want to make sure that we talk about translanguaging, because it's about doing. It's not just something that we have. And here's a definition that Ricardo and I have written about, and that is often cited. Translanguaging is the deployment, and again, I'm emphasizing the verb, the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for the watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages. So, translanguaging emphasizes the human factor in communication, with language users actively selecting, as Paco did, his linguistic, semiotic, multimodal features from their own unitary repertoire, no one else's, their own, in relationship, of course, to the listeners who are also the engaged interpreters of the message, right? So just to sort of bring this together, translanguaging as a unitary repertoire, which is what I adhere to, means that all speakers do language with their own unitary repertoire that they assemble, that they bring together, as Pedagogical has taught us to say. This is a network of linguistic semiotic features with which we all make meaning for our own lives, and every life is different, and that's why you can't say that it's the same for everybody. So the problem in viewing English as a language entity to be spoken and taught is that many speakers are not given the freedom to use many of the features in their repertoire. And when they do, they're like Paco did, they're said to be deficient or mixed up. And I think what I want all of you to question is, who are those speakers that are not given the freedom to make their own meaning? Some of us are allowed to use whatever we want to make our meaning, and yet some of us are not. So who are they and why? So, translanguaging English to teach English. And I'm using again translanguaging as a verb. How do we translanguage English to teach English? So it's not a named language to be had with its own separate features and structures. Yes, it's English done with a locus of enunciation of speakers following the naming of Walter Mignolo, the Argentinian semiotician, whoever they may be, right? So it's again, from the speakers up. The locus of enunciation is in the hands of the speakers, not in the hands of the institution or the teacher. And yes, resisting ideologies of English hegemony, power, and the racial linguistic ideologies that make us listen to the many ways in which speakers do English and be inclusive of all and for all. Rather, I said that backwards. Right? So what we want to do is make sure that we go beyond the racial linguistic ideologies that see people who are racially different, and yes, race does exist as a social construct, that see them then being deficient no matter what it is that they're speaking or how they're speaking, right? So how do we give everybody the right to be inclusive? So again, just to think about, we talked about English language ideology and we talked about bilingual, multilingual ideology. If English has to be translanguaged, bilingualism, multilingualism also has to be translanguaging. So we're not talking about simply going across English and a language other than English, but going beyond English and languages other than English. Notice what I'm saying. We're not talking about code switching, right? It's not code switching. It's not code switching because there are not two boxes of languages. There's not an L1 and an L2, as we thought with the bilingual ideology, but what we have is a unitary repertoire of features. I use the image of pearls, a string of pearls, right? A string of pearls that we all have. We have our own pearls. Sometimes our pearls are not what the school thinks they're pearls, but they're pearls. And they're pearls and have value and are academic in their own, right? It's not that there is something out there that's academic language and what these other practices are non-academic. They're also academic. They just do not match the way that academic language has been defined in schools. So what we have, of course, is this repertoire of features, and what you're doing as English teachers is adding these additional pearls, extending the repertoire. But notice the difference. The difference is that we are not threatened within our identity because we still have our pearls. You're just adding new ones. Very different concept from thinking that English is a separate entity, a separate object that could threaten our other identity. So it's a different concept. It's inclusive. I'm not, worrying about whether it's better or worse. I'm worried about whether we're including everybody. And I think as English education grows around the world, what is important to notice is that it makes social differences for people. So how do we teach English in ways that are inclusive of everybody, that are inclusive of all practices, that really reach everybody, not just the elite, not just the ones in power, but everybody. So it's inclusive of all the practices and all people. And this is important for Europeans especially, because I don't see translanguaging only being for intercultural purposes. Yes, there's some of that. It's good for intercultural purposes. But what has to be acknowledged is the intraculturality of speakers, the fact that we're not one thing, we're not one culture, we're not one language. We have within us a whole range of language and cultural and historical identities that define us and that cannot be taken away if we're going to be subjects with power. So what are translanguaging pedagogical practices? And notice that I'm not saying pedagogical translanguaging. I'm saying translanguaging pedagogical practices. Why? Because I do think that sometimes we have sort of divorced the practice from the theory. And I do think that there's no difference between the theory and the practice. We have to talk about it at the same time. So I am making sure that our pedagogical practices are based on a translanguaging theory that is inclusive of everyone, that recognizes the unitary repertoire, and that recognizes that all our pearls have value. So we say in this book that we titled The Translanguaging Classroom, there are three components to translanguaging pedagogical practices. One is the stance, and I think this is key. If you don't have a stance, a set of beliefs that this is really where it's at, you cannot do anything else. So you have to work on your set of beliefs first, then you have to design. Well, look what you're designing. You're not designing something different. You're designing something that emerges from your own stance, your translanguaging stance, and that leverages what I have called the translanguaging corriente, which is always in the classroom, right? All of us who teach know we teach this, but the students are somewhere else, right? And there's this translanguaging corriente that goes on that we have to somehow bring to the surface. We don't see it many times because we have kept it down. But how do we bring it to the surface? And then there has to be shifts. That is, these unplanned moves that are responding to the students' corriente, right? So the idea that we cannot, and that's the reason why I'm insisting that they cannot be just pedagogical translanguaging, because this has to adapt to the translanguaging corriente in a classroom, and these are all changes. So let me just go back to Mr. Antonio, who's back in Peru. Take a sip of water, and I'll continue. So back in Peru, Mr. Antonio has the stance of he's doing English from the students up. That is, the locus of control of English, of language use, lies with the students, not with him. He's doing English with emergent English speakers along all points of the multilingual continuum. He's doing English in relationship to other language practices and epistemologies, and he's decolonizing ideologies of named languages, now both English and Spanish, because you might think that in this classroom in Peru, everybody's a Spanish speaker, but there are also many Quechua speakers, and we have to also recognize the colonial nature of many of the other languages. So this is very complex, and we have to realize that it's much more than just English that's operating as a power of control. So the classroom is learner-centered, of course. It's project-based. It's all about experiential learning. It's about selecting what I call temas and then textos, selecting the topics that are important for the students, and then thinking of what are the texts that would be important to think about this topic. Then collaboration among everybody, always translanguaging in the process for the product. He's teaching English. The product should be as much as possible in English, but notice what I'm saying. Their own English, not the English of the text, because the English of the text is not their own English and they have to make it theirs. So that's what Mr. Antonio does. So what does he do with the classroom linguistic landscape? He makes sure that there are resources that are multilingual at the tables. He makes sure that on the walls there are multilingual word walls and sentence starters. And he groups for research, for reading, for discussion, for pre-writing, for the performances that they do in supposedly English, in their own English. And he reminds the students that, yes, the texts may be in English. Some of them are commercial texts, but many of the texts that he uses are also locally produced by the community, both oral texts and written texts. And the emphasis is on listening to each other, to other ways of languaging. So this is a classroom where Quechua is regularly not used, but because Mr. Antonio really believes in leveraging the entire repertoire of the students, he does allow this. And think of what this does in a country that is said to be monolingual, English, Spanish only, teaching English, but also at the same time acknowledging the multilingualism of many of its people that has not been previously recognized. I want to say and remind everybody that translanguaging pedagogical practices are not strategies, right? They're not strategies. It's opening up these spaces so people can breathe, so people can learn, so people can imagine, so people can be creative, and giving students the freedom to do language, to make meaning with whatever resources they have. And I always say, for me, there are 4 purposes of opening up translanguaging spaces. In Peru, it's important to have a space for English because the society doesn't speak it. So I'm not saying abolish that space. That space is important. But within that space, find out how to open up these translanguaging spaces for different purposes. And I talk about 4 of them. One is to scaffold, right? To scaffold because students do not understand. And if they do not understand, there's no learning that takes place. You can talk English all you want. If they are not understanding what you're saying, if they don't understand the text, there's no learning taking place. So you have to scaffold. And in scaffolding, you have to know when to scaffold, when to put that translanguaging ring so that they survive, and when to take it off, too. And it might be that for some tasks they need it, and for some other tasks they don't need it. And you have to be able to do that. To document and assess what they know. Sometimes you have to know, is it that they don't have the English features to express themselves? Or is it that they don't know anything about, I don't know, history? So you have to be able to open up a space sometimes to find out what it is that students really know. To deepen understandings. All of us, when we read something, sometimes we read individually, we don't understand. But I always reach out to my best students to say, could you read this for me and let's talk about it? And that's how you deepen understandings. And that discussion doesn't have to be in the language of the text, because remember, every time you engage with a text, you are making it yours. So there are no monolingual texts if bilingual people are involved. If bilingual readers are really engaged with the text, that text becomes dynamic and bilingual, multilingual. And especially, and I want to emphasize this last purpose, to deepen and transform individual subjectivities and the critical consciousness of all speakers and listeners. I want to say, I can't see, how many minutes? Oh, all right. Oh, I'm rushing because I thought I have to get through. So I want to say that the transformational aspects of translanguaging, I know people say there hasn't been no transformation, but you know, that's only if we think that the act of speaking, the act of getting engaged is not transformational for individuals. Individuals who have been taught that they're inferior, and we have developed through schools and institutions subjectivities of inferiority. So how is it that we then can transform those subjectivities of inferiority to think that they are capable and not inferior? And the critical consciousness of all speakers and listeners, I think we really have to make sure that our students understand the role that language has had in controlling people. And I think it's very important for people to have that, for students to have that socio-historical consciousness. But not only for the speakers, but for the listeners. Even more transformational is to make sure that we listen to each other in ways that acknowledge our very different ways of languaging and of being and of meaning. So in translanguaging, language practices are not in competition. There are no hierarchies of language, because what you're doing is you're building the English speakerhood of emergent bilingual students, not simply keeping English pure. You're protecting people and their identities. You're extending doing English by multilinguals for multilinguals, because after all, we are no longer just teaching English for other monolinguals. We're teaching English and speaking English often to other multilinguals. So how do we then extend it, not only doing it by multilinguals, but also for multilinguals, and extending this historical and sociopolitical consciousness of the role of language in speakers and listeners. Finally, the third element that I talked about was the shifts, and I think shifts are very important in classrooms, right? You have to be a learner, and I'm sure I've heard this before, you have to be a teacher who's a co-learner, right? Because what you really want is you want to follow the students' translanguaging corriente as they language and act, and you want to give the students the freedom to act with their translanguaging corriente, which is always different in different classrooms. So I'm taking here from a title of a recent book, My Multilingual Matters, that I did with my colleague, Maite Sanchez. It's about Latinx students in the United States, but we called it Translanguaging Sin Miedo, without fear, because I think many of us do all of this, but we are afraid to do it because language policy in the schools tells us that we can't. And I really think I have a lot of admiration for teachers, and people always tell me, Ofelia, you don't work enough on language policy from the top. No, because I really believe that the transformation happens with your acts, through your teaching. But it has to be, but many times we're afraid because we're working against the policy, right? So how do we do it without fear? Sin miedo. Because we're liberating all the students to really select from their repertoire to make meaning for themselves. Because our meaning may not be their meaning. So how do we get them to really act to make meaning for themselves? And liberating the text from this monolingual, monocultural meanings. Because again, any time that you read and that you enter a text, whether it's a written text or an oral text, any time that you enter a text, as a person, you're making your own meaning, not the meaning of the text. So why does English language profession need translanguaging? Why do you need translanguaging? Because I want to repeat again the words of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who says that there cannot be any social justice without cognitive justice. That is, we really have to change our way of thinking around languages if we're going to move things to make sure that there's social justice for all speakers. So the focus has to be on the creative and critical capacity of whole human beings to engage in languaging, not the language of policies of the states and their schools, enabling racialized students to act with their full repertoire, as do others, by the way. Some have the privilege to act with their full repertoire, especially in assessment. And then we give it to the others, and we ask them to work with less than half of their repertoire. Think of the injustice in that. And to reject these racial linguistic ideologies that listen to minoritized multilinguals as deficient and having to fit a monolingual mold that they're never going to be and that it doesn't need to be. So again, why? So just to summarize, because they're going to get me off this in a second, I want to go back to just, again, repeating what I said about translanguaging in general. I said that it starts by leveraging the student's linguistic or semiotic system to make meaning and learn, and it validates and leverages the community socio-historical linguistic semiotic practices. I want to repeat what it is not. It is not simply using the first language to learn a second language. That's not translanguaging. It is not code switching. It's not code mixing, because we're not talking about two codes. We're talking about the string of pearls. Everybody has their own string of pearls that we use to adorn ourselves in very different ways, depending on how we act and who we act with. And it is not what we call in the United States Spanglish, or I've heard Binglish here, etc. It's not any of that, right? And therefore, the translanguaging classroom, the translanguaging pedagogical practices have to be inclusive and have to give all students the freedom to assemble their resources. But they're not simple strategies, not simple strategies. They're translanguaging pedagogical practices following, and following is an important word. You're not putting the language before the speakers. You're putting the speakers before the language, the students before the language, and you're following their sociolinguistic practices. Is not simply the use of a named L1, it's the use of everybody's language practices that are not a named L1. Is not just going across languages, is not code switching, and it's not a simple scaffold. If I have any regrets, is that some people have understood translanguaging as just simply going across languages. If you start with that conception, that's not translanguaging, right? So how do you think about language without thinking of these objects, these entities, and think instead of the speaker and their own repertoire? So it has to rest on this human view of languaging and teaching, and it must center and leverage the student's linguistic repertoire, semiotic repertoire, and extend it with pearls that they own. And that is very important. The pearls that they own, not our pearls, not the pearls in the book, the pearls that they own. They have to own it. They have to be owners of their own English. They cannot be owners of British English or US English or anything else. So I just want to end by giving you this resource. Ricardo and I did translanguaging work in 67 schools in New York City. The website is up. It has lots of guides, lots of videos. Not all of it I'm proud of. It's taking steps. We have this philosophy of Antonio Machado, which is you make the road upon walking, right? No hay camino, se hace camino al andar. So we're doing this together. So I'm saying that because within the website, there are all kinds of things that a large team, it was a large team, has developed, all of which is not where I am today, but it was where I was where we began to work with schools, because if you've ever worked with schools, you know you have to negotiate. Each school is different, each policy is different, each population is different. And just to end then, these are more resources that came from the project. We call it lovingly CUNY-NICEF for City University of New York, New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilinguals, but we have expanded, and people in the team, ex-students, etc., have done a lot of work on literacy. I want to recommend Rooted in Strength and En Comunidad, which are wonderful books on translanguaging literacy. And then I want to recommend Mike Mena, who does a YouTube, and he has a wonderful YouTube on translanguaging and other things, very interesting. Muchas gracias.